welcome to the fifth webinar in our 2026 Women in Leadership Executive Speaker Series, with this one titled Trailblazing Justice, a conversation with Christine Durham on women, leadership, and the law. I'm Dr. Susan Madsen, founding director of the Utah Women in Leadership Project and an extension professor of leadership at the Utah State University. And I'm the host, and we'll be interviewing our guest today. This event furthers the mission of the Utah Women in Leadership Project, which is to strengthen the impact of Utah girls and women. And we strengthen Utah and its residents by first, producing relevant, trustworthy, and applicable research. Second, creating and gathering valuable resources. And third, convening trainings and events that inform, inspire, and ignite growth and change for all Utahns. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, of course, the Utah Women in Leadership Project and also Utah State University Extension. And so I'd like to just jump right in and introduce Justice Durham. Christine M. Durham served on the Utah Supreme Court from 1982 to 2017, including a decade as the Chief Justice from 2002 to 2012. Appointed by Governor Scott Madsen, that's been a while since he was the governor. She was the first woman to serve on Utah's highest court and earlier became the state's first female district court judge. So over her 35-year judicial career, she has championed access to justice, civic education, and systemic reforms that strengthen Utah's courts. So she earned her bachelor's degree from Wesley College and her law degree from Duke University School of Law. And she began her career teaching legal medicine at Duke University School of Medicine and practicing law in North Carolina before moving to Utah in 1973. So she also taught at Brigham Young University's J. Reuben Clark Law School and co-founded a law firm before joining the bench. So Durham's leadership extended nationally, and she served as president of the Conference of Chief Justices and on the board of trustees at Duke University. You have that connection to Duke University, I see. And some of her honors included the William L. Rehnquist Award for Judicial Excellence and multiple honorary degrees. Widely admired for breaking barriers, which she has done, she remains a trailblazer in law, leadership, and equality. And I love the title that we have for this, Trailblazing Justice. So welcome. It's good to have you here, Christine.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Well, I have lots of questions, but
Okay.
those of you listening in, definitely put your questions either in the chat, that'll go to me directly, or in the Q&A. I'll check them both. But I really would love to have you start, and thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. When you look back at your early career, I'm starting back there, what experiences or mentors, either one or both, most shaped your path towards judicial leadership? Tell us a little bit about that.
I've been thinking about that question. I appreciate it. And it's a difficult one for me because when I graduated from college, and then when I graduated from law school, which was in 1972, there was around 2% of the legal profession in this country that was made up of women. So it was a very sparse opportunity. At the same time, there were people in my circle, certainly in my family, and my secret is the man that I married. When I told him that I wanted to go to law school and so on, he smiled and said, "Oh, that sounds exciting."
I love it. Now, were you raised in Utah, or were you raised other?
No,
Okay.
I was born in Los Angeles.
Okay.
And our family moved right out of, I went through elementary school in LA, then we moved to Washington, D.C. I went to middle school in D.C., And then when I was 14, our family moved. My father was working for the Treasury Department, and we moved to Paris. And he
Oh,
was,
interesting. So
that's
you,
right, he was a deputy treasury person at the Paris embassy, and I
oh,
went to the American school for 2 years, and then I spent my last year at a French lycée. So I was
you
able
really
to.
had
I
to,
know, and pure, just strangeness. But for me, it turned out to be a wonderful experience, and
wonderful.
I learned a great deal about the world traveling in that
Yeah,
fashion. And my parents were very supportive and comfortable
yeah.
with things I wanted to do.
So was
So,
it a
and
surprise when your husband said, that sounds exciting?
oh, it was a surprise because I dated others
Yeah.
and I didn't get the same reaction from
Oh,
a lot of
okay.
people that I dated. It was still a very strange thing for a woman to do. And not only that, but we uh, devised a family motto very early on in our marriage, and it is, if there's a harder way to do it, we'll find it.
Oh,
So I did work in Boston for a little while. I actually started law school in Boston, which I've never in my life met anyone else who went to 3 law schools, but I did. I had 1 year I have a semester at Boston College, a semester at Arizona State, where my husband was teaching and trying not to get sent to Vietnam. And then he started medical school at Duke, and I
okay.
went to Duke for the next 2 years. But there was not a single woman at Duke on the faculty. There had been one in the past, but there were none when I was there.
Mm.
But the faculty, we had, I think there were about 10 of us in the law school at that point in time. And we went to the administration and said, we need some support. So what they did was give us money, and we used that
Oh,
money, which turned out to be an amazing experience. We used that money to bring speakers to identify
oh,
women to come to the law school and talk to us as a small seminar. One of They were all quite stellar people, very young. One of them was a young law professor at Rutgers who was teaching gender in the law, although I think it was called sex in the law in that era. And she was also very active with the ACLU doing gender related classes. Her name was Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
oh,
And,
I was wondering.
and she came down to Duke for 2 days, gave us an all day seminar. She was working very hard on the Equal Rights Amendment. It had just come out of Congress. And so we spent a lot of conversation on what we could do on the Equal Rights Amendment. And, she was inspiring to all of
Oh,
us. I mean, she was a mentor to all of us. And she and I had a lot in common in that I had my first baby 2 weeks before I started law school. And my second baby, that's where the if there's a harder way to do it. Our second baby was born my third year in law school. And Ruth had a very similar background. She had started with children, and then her husband also had a very serious health problem while they were in law school. And she just forged along. And I thought, well, if she can forge in that
then
way,
you
why
can do
not?
it.
It can be done.
Uh,
So that was very helpful. And there were other people later on, other women that I encountered who were doing things that made you think that they were possible.
mm,
So that was very helpful. And there were some men in the mix too. A former dean of Duke with who had not been the dean when I was there, so he didn't even know me personally, but he was very active in a very important legal organization called the American Law Institute.
mm.
And he put my name up for membership as a very young graduate and so on. And he introduced me to people, and he made sure I got on committees.
Wow,
And that just to have the opportunity to do
I
those
love
things
that.
was quite remarkable. And when we moved to Salt Lake City after I was 2 years out of law school. my husband was behind me in medical school. So that's why I was hanging around
Yeah.
and
We do
scrounging
that.
scrounging for jobs in North Carolina. And then when we went to Utah, I again, life is so strange, but there was a classmate of mine from Duke who was from Utah and who had he'd come back to Utah and was working with a securities lawyer, and he talked me up to the head of this small firm, and I got a job in securities, which I had completely avoided in law school. I had no idea what I was doing, but it turned out to be a wonderful
You learn.
experience. And the people that I worked with at that small firm, again, gave me a lot of support when I decided to try for the bench. I was really much too young, but because one of the things I did in North Carolina was just join up. All my friends from nonprofits and so on would send me cases. I took cases off of the criminal things, and I took anything I could get.
Yeah.
And in the end, when I was actually brave enough to put my name in for a judgeship, uh, a lot of puffing was going on, if you know that expression,
Yes.
in which I pointed out that I'd done criminal work, done domestic work, I had done civil work, and so on, and so that I really had a broad experience, even though it was in a very short period of time. So I was the first woman ever to sit on the general jurisdiction trial court in Utah, and that was due to Governor Matheson. And talk about someone who really was a mentor for me. He cared a lot about the judiciary. He was interested in getting younger people and doing some work in the courts. And I think actually, again, talk about coincidence. He had a daughter who had gone to Wellesley, and he
Oh.
was very impressed by Wellesley. Thought it was a wonderful school, and so I think that helped me as well. So, and he was still on the bench, and it was quite. My predecessor on the Supreme Court had passed away, and at the funeral, Governor Matheson came and sort of pulled me out of line in the waiting room, the viewing room, and he said, I'm not in charge of what happens for the selection committee, but if you get through it, you're going. So I got through it, and he put me on the Supreme Court after 4 years on the trial bench.
Oh.
It was just amazing. And
Such good sponsors,
yeah, those were
mentors,
good sponsors.
sponsors.
You're
Such
right.
good.
And the coincidence of it all was, I look back and just think, my goodness.
Yeah. I love that. Um, yeah. Well, I wanted to also ask you, so you've brought us up to the point that you're really the first woman appointed to the highest court. And what do you remember most vividly about stepping into that role for the first time? And especially as a Chief Justice as well.
Right. Well, I didn't do that for a few years.
Yeah.
But one of the things about that office is that there isn't any, at least in my era, and I don't think these days, there's no training system for
Oh,
the Supreme Court justices. There's, training in some administrative things, and there's actually back in that era. So I came on in '82. We didn't even have a formal education program in Utah, and not many
mm,
states in the country had such a thing. In fact, that was one of the projects that I really cared a great deal about and spent a lot of time in my early days, was working on education for judges.
yeah.
And we have now one of, I think, the most impressive education programs in the country. We are admired and followed by other courts. But the interesting thing about being on the court is you're completely dependent on your colleagues And some of my colleagues were very friendly and supportive. Some were not so much.
So a little resistance. I was going to ask you about resistance. Did you get some resistance along your way
Yes,
too?
yes, there was some resistance. I think among other things, I can think of one colleague who clearly wasn't impressed by the fact that I wasn't a Utahn, that I hadn't been
Oh,
educated in Utah, and so I didn't have those kinds of connections. I think, looking back, I think he might have I was an unknown
mm,
um, presentation for him, and that I think he found that quite difficult. He never got over it either.
oh,
At one point years ago, I don't tell this story too much in Utah because some people will know who the people are,
oh,
but I had indicated I'd been on the court 20 years by this point,
no.
and there was an opportunity to become the Chief Justice, and I made it known that I would be interested in the so forth. And he had this individual had indicated who his choice was,
Yeah,
and that the other choice that was in it was somebody he didn't want.
yeah.
But he said he would vote for the person he didn't want rather than vote for me. So, it wasn't too supportive at that point in time. But
How did you handle? I mean, did you just put your head down, just keep going, kind of
yeah,
brush it aside? It's hard for women sometimes to just brush. We like to be liked,
we
you
do
know.
like to be liked. Yeah, and it was it was not comfortable at the least, although it wasn't a surprise to me. So at the time, what I did was, well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and went away and started campaigning in other
Yeah.
places on the court. And I was very fortunate to be able to take that job, and I loved it and it surprised me in some ways, because the reason I loved the Supreme Court and wanted to be there and felt so privileged to be there was that I love the law. I really do. And
Mm,
it's such an amazing job to
yeah.
spend your working time looking at the history of law, the future of law, the morphing. What a lot of people don't understand is that at the Supreme Court level, yes, the legislature makes the laws, but there's a huge amount of law that that is actually evolved through the common law, and that is overseen by the court, the
Courts.
Supreme Court. And so you have an opportunity to be a change maker as well.
Yeah.
And there were so many areas where there had not been investigation and study of the history of some kinds of law. And I think, for example, of one that relates to some degree, for sure, to gender, and that's domestic law.
Yeah.
The
The
Canada,
family courts.
the
Yeah.
family courts, and the law that the Supreme Court had as a matter of common law been developing forever, and the legislature had not at that time. That has changed since then. But it was a time when the Supreme Court had opportunities to really change some of the um, basic ideas and laws themselves in connection with domestic law. So, for example,
Mm,
how you divided up property, how children's custody was allocated,
yeah. Yeah.
and our court had a real impact on that. A lot of change
Oh,
occurred, and then when in the mid '80s to late '80s, there were a lot of changes, and the creation of the Intermediate Court of Appeals,
okay.
and by statute, domestic law was moved into that court in the first
Okay.
instance. But at that point in time, there had already been a lot of changes,
Mhm.
in the law. And so they continued to develop it, but it was on its way. And it had been many, many years before, it had really been a priority for people. So that was really
And that
exciting.
must be, it must feel rewarding because you know that you're changing people's lives, families' lives, kids' lives in the law and what ends up coming out of that. I mean, it you must feel that from time to time, and it gives you energy to
It
continue.
does. And the truth is, I was the only woman on the court. I was the only person on the court who had major responsibility for my own children and,
Oh,
had lived in an industry that, didn't have a lot of experience with that. And actually, we had one very interesting case that involved, um, it involved whether there was a tort, namely a legally, uh, an illegal action that could be pursued as a tort, but the vote was 4-1, and the question was whether what had happened was that a medical procedure had failed, and the result was a mother with extremely serious disabling um, illness, mental illness, and had a child when she and her husband did not want a child because there had been a failure in the medical procedure. And the
uh,
question was, it's still a very,
yeah,
difficult question,
yeah.
but the question was, is that a tort? Is it a wrong that a healthy child should be born to a mother who couldn't care for it? And it was 4-1.
Uh, wow.
And I always realized, I'm not saying they were wrong and I was right, but I am saying that given their life experiences at the time versus mine, did
Yeah.
not provide the same perspectives on the decision making.
And that's what we know from the research on and on for
Right.
decades and the gender is that you do because of your life experiences, because of your responsibilities, all the education, everything, that you look often, not always, but often women look at things differently than men and bring those perspectives to men. Uh-oh. There you go.
There we are.
You're
Yep.
good. You're good. So I wanted to, there was a question that brought in the element of, here, there you go. There's a question that brought in the element of imposter syndrome, and I
Oh,
actually
yes.
had that in one of my questions. And so you've gone through and described so many awesome,
Oh.
things and how you've gotten to where you were at, but and how mentors helped and sponsors. But did you feel, I'm sure you did, most people do, did you feel that imposter syndrome jumping up or just self-doubt here and there? And what did you do with that?
Well, and my own experience suggests that everybody, unless they're mentally not quite there, experience imposter system, especially in a professional job. In fact, I remember when my husband started his on ward experiences, and I said, you're going to go in and you know, put needles in them and so on. And how are you going to do that? He said, I'm just going to do it. And that's what I did. I can remember going to court in my first criminal case, my first domestic case, and thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing. And
But you did
but I
know,
did it. And
yes,
that's what I
but
did.
you
And the
did
other
know more
thing,
than you gave yourself credit. I'm sure it comes up and you learn.
well, one of the things that I learned from was doing, first of all, not just necessarily because you learn more, you hopefully do, but the other thing I found out, frankly, I mean, I went into some really interesting rural courts in North Carolina and so on, and I'd be there with really experienced lawyers, and I'd watch them work. And every
Oh,
once in a while, you'd be very impressed. And you'd think, oh, I'll never be able to do that. But sometimes you'd watch them work and you'd think, I can do that.
yeah, yeah.
I can do that. That's not that hard. I can put it together. And it was very useful to find people whom I respected and admired, and seeing if I couldn't get advice from them. And,
I like that.
make friends and say, can you give me some advice on this, that, and the other? And some brushed me off, but some would talk to me. And one of the things I did over the years, I had opportunities to teach. It was one of the things I always mentioned with law students, the whole imposter process. It happens even in school, of course,
Yeah. Yeah.
and in law school. But it's important for people to know, as you've emphasized, that it comes to everyone. And if it isn't coming to them, they may be missing something.
Yeah.
So I,
You
the only
just
thing I
put your
ever
head
figured,
down.
yeah, is put my head down and keep doing and taking opportunities and saying yes to things that I was starting from scratch. But everywhere I've gone, in terms of working with people at different levels and in different areas of the law and in different jobs, I have always found people that I admire and try to get help from,
Yeah.
and people that I think I can do it as well as they're doing
That's
it.
well.
So, yeah,
And sometimes I've found and I've talked to many people that have used different strategies where they really hate asking people and getting turned down. They don't like that. They feel like, but then they changed it into a little game. I'm going to ask six people and I'm going to hooray if two of them. Like
that's
that's a
good.
success. And so and the other ones just say, "Oh well." You have to kind of practice at that, especially if you have those self-doubts a lot. I wanted to ask you, from your vantage point on the bench, how, this is the Utah Women in Leadership Project, so I want to keep going on a few gender questions. But how did you see gender dynamics play out in the legal profession, and how have those dynamics evolved? I'm sure
Right.
there's a lot of involvement, although, it's evolved, although I still connect with women in law who continue to struggle with sexism and those things. So it's not gone away 100%. Let's just put it that way.
No, for someone my age who started with all this in 72, you could be a little discouraged sometimes to
Yeah.
see how much work there still is to do. What has made a huge difference uh, over time is there becoming a large enough number of women in a community or in the profession. Because as I mentioned, in 1972, we're talking
Yeah.
2%. There were, I'm trying to remember, there had been two other judges in Utah, Reva Beck Bozzoni,
Yeah.
who was a city judge, who was elected by a city judge. She was the first. And then there were two others who were appointed, one to the juvenile court and one to a new lower
It
court.
was really early though. Yeah.
Yeah, they were in mid 70s and so on. So there were, by the end of the 70s, there were four of us at very levels on the court. And of course, the juvenile court wasn't even part of the court system in that
Yeah.
era. It was under the governor. But to go back to the original part of your question, what made a huge difference to me was encountering any other women and being able to talk to them about our experiences and ways in which they've dealt with it that sometimes gave me ideas. And I ran into some really
Mm.
tough tough people. When I was on the trial bench, I remember a meeting where I was I had problems with the way they were handling the docket, because they'd put five domestic cases on that calendar thing, and if the first one went, everybody else went home. And in the conference, I said to the other judges, I think maybe we ought to have some backup judges who could pick up
Oh
other
yeah.
people who were scheduled and waiting, and so on. There was a pause. One of the older guys said, well, I'm sure Judge Durham, when she gets a little more experience with her docket, she'll be able to manage. And I'm going, it won't help me do 5 cases at a time, I assure you. But so that, that was just mean. And there were other mean things. Nobody invited me for lunch for the 4 years I was
Oh,
on
I'm
court.
sure that's still actually women and men going to lunch, especially when it's one-on-one. I'm
Yeah.
sure, it's still a problem today, in
Oh,
Utah.
yeah. And actually, another thing that I ran into was that male lawyers on cases I was on didn't want to go to lunch or travel for work because their wives didn't like it. And I'm
Yeah,
going, what?
exactly.
What? Yeah. So there was a lot of sexism that really permeated the profession for quite a long time. And one of the first times I tried a trial on the district court, uh, an older lawyer came up after the trial was over. So I just want to tell you, I didn't think much of the idea of a woman judge, but you did okay. Just going, thank you, sir. You just have to ignore a great deal of that.
Yeah,
You have to pay attention when it's actually interfering with the quality of your work or your access to it in any way.
yeah,
Um, and it was a little bit helpful to go on the Supreme Court. You get a little more respect up there, so
yeah,
hope
yeah.
it helps.
Well, thank you so much. I'm actually, I have a whole list of questions, but
Right,
I am, I'm going to pull in um, a few questions. One person asked specifically about, and there's an assumption that you're Latter-day Saint, and really talked about, did faith come in? Let me just read the question. Um, you mentioned being from outside of Utah. Did your faith help you build your law community and connections in Utah, or did the nature of the work make faith kind of a non-factor? And any advice? This person says any advice for those people that are not of the Latter-day Saint faith?
right.
That's an interesting question, I thought.
That is an interesting question in Utah, particularly. Um, I think, well, we're all shaped in so many ways, and certainly um, religious commitment and activity, especially if you're very committed and care a lot about that, you um, have to manage that, I think, carefully. Uh,
Yeah.
I was a little bit in between. I mean, being very candid, I was raised in Los Angeles first, and then Eastern and Europe and so on. And my family was an active LDS family, but I was the one who, I talked back. And coming to Utah, I came with a little bit of a whatchamacallit on my shoulder,
Yeah.
because first of all, my own orientation to the law and to judging was skeptical about the combination of faith and judicial work,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
because it worried me. Well, in fact, I remember one instance in an educational program for judges, and we were talking. We had a representation at that meeting from someone from one of the institutes on LGBTQ issues, and from California, one of the universities there. And a judge stood up and said, I'm a Mormon, and this is what we think about LGBTQ, and that's the way we should run our courts. And I stood up and said, you're wrong. You are absolutely wrong. You are not being asked to interpret your religion. You are not being asked to
Wow.
impose the rules of your religion. You are a judge, and your job is the law. And
Oh,
religion, has connections historically, especially because a lot of our law comes from religious inventions. But my own view was always it had no business in the court, except, collaterally. So, for example,
yeah,
if you're
yeah,
if you're sentencing and a family has commitments that affect the way they're going to operate. But I felt very strongly about that. For me, that was just
yeah.
a no-go. And I also,
I appreciate that. Yeah,
yeah, and I made it a point to be very careful in my friend groups and social
yeah.
associations and so on, not to highlight that. And other people, do that very
Do it
differently.
differently. Yeah. But we have to go with what feels right for us and what feels
Right,
ethical for us as well. And I used to teach business ethics a lot, and that line is different for different people, right?
right.
There's a couple questions coming in that relate to one of the questions that I have. So let me ask my question first, and then I'll bring in a couple. But I really, you have been very, spoken out often about fairness and about equity.
Mhm.
How do you see the law's role in advancing gender equity today compared to when you began? And I know the word equity is kind of a loaded word, but fairness, let's use the word fairness. And you see, especially in family court and other places, you see that things are not right sometimes with
Yes.
the power between men and women. And I would say, not just gender, but there's other kinds of diversity as
Oh,
well.
absolutely.
So wrestle with that a little bit with us.
Well, I'm an outsider in some circles, but one of the things that I did very soon after going on the bench, two trial judges in California, Los Angeles, they got two uh, helpers from Wellesley College, interns, and they got them to attempt nationally, and there were no records they could find. They started from scratch trying to identify women judges all over the country. And approximately 75 of those women, and I was one of them in 1979, showed up in LA, and we formed the National Association of Women Judges. And our commitment was to recruit, to support, and to increase the population of women on the bench. So that was my first foray into that
And
kind of
when was
work.
that again? When was that again?
1979.
Okay, so that was a while ago.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
was
that
a
was,
while ago. And I remember I came home and I was still at the law firm, and it was before I went on the bench. And well, actually, I'd just got on the bench, and I was having lunch with a good friend of mine who still is a good friend of mine. But I was up. And he said, well, what'd you think about it all? And I said, I think this work will not be done until at least half of the bench is female. And his eyes got very wide and he said, well, I don't know if we want to go that far. And I was shocked. I was just shocked that he was my good friend and he didn't think that was maybe a good idea.
it was so out there. I keep going, but let me just say, I say that was a long time ago, but in the scope of things,
Yeah.
that wasn't that long ago.
Well, I know. And what's happened now, of course, that actually that organization is in a pickle of a place along with
They're still
dozens.
moving today.
Well, what's happening today is you can't say equity, you
Oh
can't
yeah,
say,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it has gotten so bizarre. And see, I've been working for 50 plus years for equity, for inclusion,
yeah,
for diversity in our legal system. That matters a great deal to me, and it still matters. And one of the organizations I've really enjoyed being part of in recent years is the Utah, let's see, it's UCLEAG, the Utah Center for Legal
yeah,
Inclusion.
yeah. I
And
know that group.
right, and it's a wonderful group, and so many lawyers have come to it. Now, we've changed our vocabulary. We now say fairness instead of equity, even though they
Yeah,
mean exactly
yeah.
the same things. but part of what is really demoralizing is the fact that I have been working on these issues. I mean, I
Yeah.
cared, I was anti-Vietnam in college, so that's how far back I go. But it's so demoralizing to see the things that are being stripped of meaning, and we're starting to see the statistics and what it's going to do
Yeah.
to certain, you know, parts of our culture, and that disturbs me very much. But
Well,
I'm pretty
silence. It's silencing
right.
women in some way. It's silencing different groups, and you can see that. I can see it
Absolutely,
play out. Yeah.
absolutely, and that is very discouraging. And the other thing that I'm very discouraged about is the fact that Utah has one of the lowest female populations in the legal profession in the
Yeah.
nation.
Yeah.
We're somewhere, last I saw the numbers, it was around 28, 29% of the 100% of lawyers are
And
female.
I've heard people say, you women should feel good about that." So,
No, no. I mean, we've been working on that for decades now. We ought to be
what's the
doing
law
better than that.
school? Do you know what the breakdown of
That's what's so strange, though, is that the law schools are getting them.
is it close
Particularly,
to 50-50 in Utah, or is it
it's
like
close at the
40-60?
University of Utah, and even at BYU, it's been up 30 to 40% the last few
Okay.
years. But they don't stay. They don't
In
find
law school or in the profession?
in the profession.
Okay, so they finish
Yeah.
law school.
And they do well, and they take their skills and they go somewhere else. And
And
that to me
so,
is just so sad.
and I know the literature kind of on that,
Yes, you
generally,
would.
but what is in your experience, what do women tell you? What what is it, the career break? Is it having families? Is it not feeling like you belong? The belonging, which is kind of a safe word to say, um, kind right now.
Well,
What is it?
well, I wish more people would tell me what it is. I usually hear
Oh,
about them after they've left. I read a really fascinating article recently by an economist out of, I think it was Stanford, and he wrote a really interesting article. He doesn't have a whole lot of data yet, but what he suggests is that this is an industry-wide problem,
yeah.
and that the problem is that women are being discouraged from professional belonging and activities because of cultural pressure. Now,
Mm,
again, I would have thought the culture pressure would have improved more, but his argument is that if you look at you know, two kids get married, they go to law school together. They both graduate with high stakes, and then the babies come, and who stays home
yeah.
with the babies?
But
Not
it's
every time anymore. It's changing
yeah.
a little,
But most of the time.
but
Yeah.
most of the time. And when they do that, they lose time, they lose money, they
Yeah.
lose advancement, and so on. And so that's one of the problems. That's one
And,
of
and,
the reasons
and
they're not, they may still be in Utah, but they're not
Yeah. But
practicing.
organizational culture, the way and I have CEOs sometimes I have these conversations, not specifically in law, sometimes in law, but they're like when women decide they can do our standards, which are they need to work this many hours, they need to do this masculine style of how things have been organized, then we'd love to have them join us.
Mhm.
Instead of there's another way.
Yeah.
And you're losing so many good women in the
Oh,
law
I know.
profession because you expect this and finance and other kinds of things because this is not good for families in general, these huge number of hours. And the law is one of those industries or sectors, I should say, that really does push some of the law firms to extensive
Absolutely.
hours.
Absolutely. However, I've spent the last 4 years at one of the big law firms, big law, that came into Utah. And there are, in our Utah office, there are more women than men.
Oh,
And
interesting.
at the present time, two of them are nursing babies. Now, it was
So,
very awkward because we're in a new building and they put glass everywhere.
oh,
And these women
glass is,
who wanted to prepare their milk for going home had to hang up their own curtains. And I'm thinking, okay, there's a things don't quite
it's a
work out.
masculine, Christine, it's a masculine
They're the ones who
thing to
designed
put
it.
glass on everything.
Right.
At certain like schools, like business schools, there's glass when you're walking upstairs, and you can
Oh, yeah.
see women don't wear, you can't
The
really wear
same clothes.
skirts
I
much.
know. Well,
Yeah.
and that's the thing I so admire about that law firm is that they really honor and support their women. They give them
I
what
love
they
it.
need in the way of timing and so on, and they bring them right along. They've
It
got
takes
generous,
conscious,
it's conscious
intentional.
support. And as a consequence, the people stay, the women stay, and they
I
come
love that.
back after leave and so on. So it can be done.
Yeah.
It can be done, but you have to really want it. Part of
Yeah.
what gets completely lost in the accounting is what happens to the men who spend 50, 60, 70 hours away from their families and their children.
Exactly.
That's not
Family
enough.
friendly impacts both. I've got a couple things from the chat. One is there's a first year law student online from BYU, and yeah, Kristen, and it's 46, she thinks,
Ah,
46% of that. And then there was a question back a little bit about the National Association of Women Judges. We already talked about that, and saw from your experience, um, what benefits did that group provide for other members and so forth? Is it a good group to be? Have you seen these associations, this and other
yeah.
associations where you can connect with women about women's helpful?
Right. Well, NAWJ started in 1979, and its mission at the time was focusing on bringing women throughout the profession, but specifically onto the bench. And for me, it was an absolute rope line, you know.
Mm.
And actually, I was very active. There were two presidents in Utah of NAWJ. Judith Billings, who is gone now, who used to be on the Court of Appeals, and I was the first. So we did an enormous amount of work. We traveled all over the country. We gave speeches.
Mm.
We went and worked with the president to talk about federal judges and so on. So it had a period of enormous energy. We've now reached the point where there are enough, certainly representatives and a lot of very, well-known and amazing women judges, and the numbers have gone up. And I think, like many organizations, it's figuring out what to do now.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of its big projects actually is working on the condition of women in prisons and
Oh,
how
okay.
they are treated and what kind of sentencing they live with, what kind of quarters they live
Yeah.
with, what kind of safety they live with, and so on. And that's very important work too. But
So
I'm
many
not,
different. Yeah,
yeah,
thanks.
yeah. So
Well,
so I think they're at a crossroads of deciding what they're going to work on, and I think there's a lot that will happen, but it's going to be interesting to watch.
yeah. So
But
I'm looking
yes,
at the
it was
time.
very important for
Yeah.
a few decades. So
I love that. I'm looking at time and going back to my questions, but I have one that's not even perfectly on one of my questions. But you have been a woman that supports women. You
yes.
have been a woman that is intentionally lifting other women, which I have to give you a shout out for that because sometimes, as you know,
Mhm.
we kind of do women do the queen bee. I don't see that as much anymore, but you get sometimes people in a key position that really, if you know, because they didn't have a lot of help, everybody's got to go through what
Yeah.
they have. So I guess my bigger question is, what can women or any leaders at this point of time in time right now, what can we do to better support women who are just getting into that pipeline, moving through the pipeline? What would you suggest?
Well, actually, one of the things that comes to mind is the program that we were talking about, UCLI, where leaders in law-related businesses and law firms are encouraged to mentor, to go up to
Yeah,
somebody who's different, and it can be female, it can be race, it can be gender. I mean, all kinds of things. But for somebody who is in a position of power to go to those people, say hi, take them to lunch, tell them they're welcome, tell them that you need them to help change some things in
yeah.
that culture. I think that's frankly, the most
Just
important thing,
reach out.
is to reach out. And people get so wrapped up, and especially if they are the kind of people, and there are people out there who are queen bees or other versions of them, and that they do a lot of damage. They
Yeah.
really do, because they uh, give off a message that the newbies are different and they don't belong. And
Yeah.
it's very hard on people. It takes a lot of moxie to walk in and say, I belong here, when you don't look like anybody,
Yeah.
or have a life like anybody
Yeah.
else. So that's the thing I care most about.
I love that. I have one more question as we wrap it up. In your in your opinion, if Utah could make one bold move to the next decade to really advance women's leadership, you can answer about women's leadership in law, but women's leadership in general, all of it relates. What could you tell? What is a bold move that we can make? And maybe a quick comment about what Utah can do, but what is a bold move we could do as well?
Well, that really is a complicated and tricky question.
Yes, it
I mean,
is.
the first thing that comes to my mind is to think about leaders who are in very important places. And with one exception, we yet to have a female governor.
Yeah.
And that in 150 years seems to me a little slow, particularly when you look back at some of our history. Some of the women in early Utah were,
Yeah.
as some people would say, badasses. I mean, um, but at the same time, the people don't vote for them. And it isn't other leaders picking leaders, although that can be useful and
Yes.
helpful. But what I really think that the pressure needs to be put on the wider culture
Mm.
and the communities who are going to the election, um, voter
To the ballot.
ballots.
Yeah.
And you see it coming up in the communities.
Yeah.
You see it in local government, but you don't look at our legislature. I mean, yeah, it's hasn't got very many Democrats, but politically, I mean, I think it might be as bad on women as it is on
Yeah.
Democrats
We have a report
coming
launching in
out.
2 weeks on where we're at in women in politics at local, and so
Oh,
that'll be
good. I'll
coming
look
out
forward
soon.
to it.
Yeah.
Well, and I hope the numbers are getting better. I mean, and it doesn't even really matter if I mean, it matters, but
Oh,
Republicans, Democrats, independents, whatever, if it's half women, it's still going to have a different color to it.
yeah,
And questions
absolutely.
are going to be asked, and research is going to be
It's
accomplished.
going to make a difference.
It's going to make
It's
a
going to make a
difference.
difference.
But our larger community of voters needs to understand
Yeah.
that, and
Yeah.
get behind the women that are locally
Yeah.
able, and make
Yeah.
sure they get to where they've got more influence.
I love that. It's actually time to wrap up. I've so appreciated your time talking with us today, and for everybody who's joined today, and those that will send the video to, and many more people will join. Thank you to our sponsors, UWLP and USU Extension. And then we have the last two webinars in this series next week. Next Monday, it is Women Leading Behind the Walls.
Uh,
So, leadership in Utah's correctional facilities. And then our last one, a week from today is Leadership in Times of Grief and Crisis, Insights from President Astrid S. Jimenez.
Oh,
So
I
those are
I
the,
so admire her. Don't
yeah,
anybody miss her? She's amazing.
yeah, those will be great. Thanks again for listening and have a wonderful rest of your day.